Fed Chairman Janet Yellen hedging her bets against another financial meltdown. Yellen is considering tougher rules for big banks to help keep credit flowing. But even she admits there are problems with forcing the banks to hold more capital. It could limit the money available for business and personal loans. So is this the right move right now? Congressman Sean Duffy is a member of the Financial Services Committee. He joins us right now to talk more about it. Congressman, good to have you on the program. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Maria.
So, you know, we keep hearing Janet Yellen, she said it again last week at the New York Economic Club speech, talk about the Fed staff looking at new tools to ensure that banks are capitalized, well capitalized, and raise more capital. Every time I speak with bankers, they say the same thing, that the higher capital levels is just making them not lend as much as they'd like to. Are we going to see more rules on the banking sector to increase capital?
Yeah, first of all, I think the committee and I would agree that the Fed should look and say, listen, what is the sweet spot for capital standards and liquidity ratios? Where if we have another financial crisis like we did in '08, we want to make sure that our banks are strong enough to weather that storm. But we have to have the sweet spot to make sure those banks can continue their core functions, which is get capital to Main Street America and to our families. What's important for us, though, Maria, is to make sure that when these rules come out, it's not a one-size-fits-all. You can't have a standard that applies to the big banks, but also have that same standard apply to mid-size and smaller community banks. And we always watch that on the committee because, you know, listen, our small community banks and credit unions and mid-sized banks function far differently and have far different risks than our larger institutions.
Well, we know that the Federal Reserve has these stress tests where they are coming out with very stressful economic situations and making sure that the banks have the wiggle room, have enough capital to handle such a stressful situation like sky-high unemployment, etc. But at this point, do you think there will be more rules for banks to carry even higher capital? Is that where we're going?
Listen, I think if I'm trying to read the tea leaves from what Yellen said in her statement a few days ago, yeah, I think so. And listen, again, you look at the downside of more capital, that might restrict some lending. But there's also a downside when they don't have enough capital. And again, it's the Fed hitting the sweet spot of making sure there's enough capital, but not too much to prohibit sound lending in the core function. And so I think what we're going to do is look at the details, because that's where the devil lies. And our committee will review the rules that come out and make sure that we get that pendulum right in the middle instead of swinging too far over where there is too much capital.
All right, let me move on to credit cards and really the transparency issue. You have been endorsing a bill that's basically asking for more transparency for the government looking at data from credit card companies. I don't know that any of our viewers or many of our viewers understand what really goes on in terms of credit card companies giving the government data that is really consumer data, and they're not even aware of it. Why don't you walk us through it?
So there's this new agency, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and it was created in Dodd-Frank. And one of the things that this agency is doing is they're collecting virtually all credit card data on most Americans. And they're keeping it not for 6 months, a year, they're keeping it for 12 years. And if you look at the NSA and America's outrage at the NSA actually collecting our phone records, where they know who you're calling, when you're calling, for what length, the government also has what you're purchasing, when you're purchasing, and how often you're doing it. Listen, this is a full new spectrum of government interference with the American people. And our question, Marie, is why do you need all of this credit card information? As you know, and we know in politics, you can take a small sample of the whole and get a representation of the whole. They're taking virtually all of it and keeping it for 12 years. Yeah. And when we ask questions, what is the purpose of this? Why are you taking it all? This new bureau, this new agency doesn't really give us a good answer. And so we're going to keep pushing them to have more transparency as to why they're doing it, what the purpose is. And frankly, I have a bill that says, listen, if you're here to protect consumers, you're not protecting us from potential terrorists like the NSA will claim. But with consumers, if you want their data and their financial information, ask them. Get their permission before you take their information. But they're doing it under the cover of darkness, and as you mentioned, most Americans don't know this is happening.
Yeah, and this is just, all you're asking for is transparency, which I think the American people would like to see. This is not the only criticism of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, is it?
No, we have a few more. Listen, Most of us on the committee would agree with the mission of the Bureau, which is protecting consumers. But we're concerned about the structure of this agency. Most agencies are funded through Congress, through the appropriations process. This agency, however, is funded through the Fed. So that gives us very little oversight on the financial side. But also there's only one director of the agency instead of a commission. So you don't get a wide range of views at top leadership. That concerns us as well. And we think with some slight reforms, that'll breed more accountability to Congress, which is the elected body, but also it'll breed more transparency in a very, very powerful agency. But to be clear, the mission we support, but it's just the structure of this agency and its power that really concerns members of Congress, and specifically those of us who are on the committee.
Yeah, and not to mention a culture at the CFPB, which is, of course, has been questioned. Congressman, thank you very much for joining us today. We'll be watching your efforts.
Thanks, Maria.